Liked it? Watch it again.
100 times better than Hamlet.
Well, it's a different type of literature. This is a piece of romantic literature. Okay, so what were the big messages that you got out of Les Mis? What are the big themes you got? What's that?
Mercy. And justice.
Mercy and justice. Okay, mercy or justice is more important. Who is the true hero of this? Is it going to be Jean Valjean? Yes. Okay, and so it's going to have this idea that mercy, having a do-over, is more important, if you will. Okay? And I think that's a pretty powerful message, and that's also why this is one of the quintessential romantic novels. Not only does it have romance of boyfriend-girlfriend kind of kissy-kissy issues, but it also deals with the notion that it's not about just strict, cold logic. Now, what was the name of the policeman again? Javert. How did Javert meet his end?
He killed himself. And Bridget spoiled it for me 2 minutes before it happened.
Okay, he kills himself. Why does he kill himself?
Because he broke the law. So that he didn't have to live with him breaking the law.
That's right. He could not bear to live himself with inconsistencies in the law, but he came to believe that mercy was important, and he let Jean Valjean go.
Which I kind of never understood. Jean Valjean stole the bread and served time in prison for it. Then he was released and became a mayor, and he was on parole, and he became the mayor eventually. But what exactly was
broke his parole?
He broke it. That's what he did. He broke his parole because he was going from basically one place to another place to go in, and that's when he stopped at the bishop's house and basically stole the silver. And the bishop said, "You're absolved, my son." Gave him that, told the police that it was a gift, and then he started down the path to righteousness.
And then
Well, he kind of is, and one of the messages of this is like you just kind of pay it forward. One kind act by the bishop. It really is the butterfly effect in this. One small gift, the bishop giving Jean Valjean a chance, then basically created a ripple effect that made other people's lives better.
So then Javert was basically trying to get Jean Valjean because he broke his parole.
Correct.
Okay. I thought it was all because of the bread, and I was like, he already paid that. I don't understand.
And so the other part of this too is there's going to be a dynamic, and this novel is published in 1862 at kind of the height of the Romantic movement. And some of you may have studied the Romantic movement, some of you may have not. But the Romantic movement was, which we're getting ready to talk about in class, was basically the pendulum the pendulum moving from the Enlightenment. And if you remember the Enlightenment, what was the Enlightenment all about? Logic was about individual right. It wasn't so much about the individual, that was the Renaissance. Okay? But it was about logic, it was about rules, it was about laws. Who would represent the Enlightenment in Les Mis? Javert, okay? Okay, so who would represent the Romantic period about its feelings and its compassion and its mercy and nature, among other things? Jean Valjean.
And Cosette and Marius.
Yes, and Cosette and Marius. Okay, now, one of the other things that I think you're going to see in this, another thing that this movie does, so you see how this, who's he going to champion? Who's Victor Hugo, the author of this, going to champion? Is he going to be championing the Romantic period or the Enlightenment based on this novel?
The Romantic period.
Romantic period, very much so.
Someone told me what happened in the movie.
Did you miss the last
Yeah, she was at Wise yesterday.
Basically, there was a big fight. Marius, was kind of like the leader of the Republic kind of thing, whatever. So they basically have a big old fight, and they're killing a bunch of people. Marius gets shot, and Jean Valjean gets approached by Javert or whatever, and basically he takes Cosette and whatever, and then basically tells Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean has the opportunity to kill Javert, and he lets him go. And so Javert's you shouldn't have done that. I'm still gonna try to kill you at some point, whatever. So then Marius gets shot. Jean Valjean's trying to take him to safety and gets stopped by Javert just a little bit later. And then Javert gives him the opportunity to let Marius go with Cosette, he drops him off. And then Jean Valjean has to be taken back. And basically Javert makes it seem like he's gonna kill Jean Valjean, and he basically is like, I've lived my whole life following all the rules and stuff, and then he unchains Jean Valjean. And so he breaks the rules by letting a prisoner go, and he chains himself and like kills himself.
It was the
also,
most
too.
dramatic.
It was so
scene ever.
dramatic. He like falls into the river and kills himself
He
because he
drowns.
finally broke a rule and he couldn't live with himself after breaking a rule, and so he killed himself. And so then it was all fine. And then Jean Valjean was walking on his way back to Cosette, and then
Yeah,
that was
he
the
like
movie.
did the Breakfast Club thing, he was like.
Yeah. He just, the end.
And what happens with Cosette and Marius?
They get to be together.
It was nice.
Good.
We were Team Marius and Cosette.
Yeah.
I was.
Well, he was passed out and shot whenever we last saw him, so we assumed they
That's
got to
true,
be together.
we assumed they
We
got together.
assume, we're not for sure.
Well, because Jean Valjean was like, he's gonna live, just needs a doctor. So he was like, yes.
Yeah, and he basically like, he brought Marius to Cosette and said it was okay.
Well, he was gonna take Marius, but he was like, no, let Marius go and have me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was gonna say he
Like,
gave
basically
up
Marius.
turned himself in.
And then he told Cosette goodbye, gave her her mother's necklace,
Finally.
and then told Cosette that he loved her mother. And I was like, oh.
Because
that's
that found out
cute.
that her mom was a whore.
Did
Did Jean Valjean go
I
back
think
to
he
him, or
just
did he
loves
just
her.
go
I
about
think
his
he
life?
was-
He went about his life.
Oh, wow.
Oh, you know that.
Yeah,
That's so sad, okay?
Because that's what I.
Who went back?
He didn't go back.
Jean Valjean didn't go back to that.
Oh, he's like a brother.
What?
Did it go back to her? I didn't know that. Because it just ended with him walking off, so we don't know what happened.
Yeah.
Aww.
Well, that's okay. I mean, he's letting them, but
He's letting
he
them
also, you know, keep in mind, was Cosette really his daughter?
No.
No, but it's again paying it forward because he was trying to help Fontaine, you know, who he felt sorry for and felt in a way guilty for because his business got her fired, forced her into a world of prostitution, and ultimately caused her demise. So, you know, he was doing what he can, and ultimately, you know, he realized that even with Cosette, he needed to let her be free.
What I didn't understand was whenever he like adopted Cosette, she was probably like 6, 7, like that's, she looked like a little bit older. But then whenever he like called, like he said like, I am your father, you will listen to me and stuff like that. She like acted like she didn't know that he was not her father and stuff. She acted
Well, I
like
think
she
she had
thought
always
she was
assumed that because he took her in and spent all that money,
that he was her father.
that he was, because why else would a man
Yeah.
take in, you know, an orphan child
Yeah.
like that? You know, particularly one who was, you know, from that low social rank and raise her as his own, which says something about him, I think, a lot.
I like that he tricked like her caretakers.
What's that?
He tricked her caretakers. Like he was like, I'll
Yes.
pay you this much, and he's like, no, no, no. Like mom said only to her, and he's like, okay, well, I'll take my money back, and here's a letter, so give me her.
Jean Valjean was quite the interesting character. It's a really famous and great piece of literature, and it's an incredibly long novel. We're going to come back and visit and discuss it a little more, but so you guys like that better than Hamlet?
Oh yeah.
We are as we move closer in the 20th century, but because I think once we get a little closer, what we'll probably take a look at is Schindler's List.
I just want to talk about that.
It's about the Holocaust. It's a Steven Spielberg film. It's really good.
I really would talk
Okay. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Industrial Revolution a little bit. The Industrial Revolution really starts taking place in the latter half of the 1700s in Great Britain and really gains strength in the 19th century. And the Industrial Revolution basically, in part, is created by the Enlightenment and the development of the scientific revolution. So it's about mechanization. But it's going to really change society a lot. So this Industrial Revolution is going to be moving work basically from piecework, what they called piecework, like let's say you were a cobbler or a shoemaker. You would have your own house, you would employ a few craftsmen, and you would hand make all of this stuff. Okay? Now, who's going to be making shoes? Factories. Okay? And as you know, factories are based on a couple of key concepts which you've heard probably since you were in second grade, okay? Division of labor, what does that mean?
Every labor is equally.
Yeah, so if you're working in a factory, your job might be to cut one piece of leather. Yours might be to cut the second piece of leather. Yours the third. Yours might be to string the laces. Yours might be to nail them. Yours might be to glue the heel on. Yours might be to put it in the box. And so what do you do for 12 hours a day?
That one job.
That same task. Okay. Now, that is in essence what the Industrial Revolution is. Where do people move? Okay?
City?
They're going to move to the big cities because that's where the factories are going to be. Initially, the factories are going to be near rivers. Why rivers initially? Water power, yeah. Now, once we start getting to coal-fired plants, why then it can be anywhere that you can transport the coal to. Okay, now, so what fueled the Industrial Revolution? Literally what fueled it at the beginning was going to be water power. And then it was going to be steam or coal, basically, that fueled the Industrial Revolution, okay, as the primary fuel. But there were also going to be, how does the Industrial Revolution change or benefit or harm the working man or woman of Europe? Okay, let's say, for instance, I was a gun maker, and we're going to use this as the all-purpose prop here. This is my gun. Okay, it's not a real gun, it's just a fake gun, so don't worry. Don't worry, folks.
There was
But-
just a school shooting in Brazil.
Oh. So, if I were a gun maker back before the Industrial Revolution, how would I make this?
You're selling piece by piece?
Piece by piece, by myself, so it might take a month to make a gun.
And if you mess it up,
And if I mess it up, it's a gun. But am I highly valued by my town and my community?
Yes.
Yes. Or if I'm a cobbler, am I highly valued by my community? Yeah, not peach cobbler, shoe cobbler. But if that's the case, what's going to happen? It's going to be piece by piece. It's going to be something along those lines. I'm going to be valued. Now, let's say I'm working in a factory. I cut out one piece of shoe leather every hour, every day. Am I going to be valued?
No.
What am I?
Just like.
I'm a cog in the machine. I am an interchangeable part. Okay? And Eli Whitney invented not only the cotton gin, but the concepts of interchangeable parts during the Industrial Revolution, which basically meant that any part can be substituted for another. Unfortunately, that also meant for the worker. So if Liz's hand gets chopped off, what do I do?
Put Maria in.
But Maria, if Maria's hand gets chopped off, what do I do?
Add me.
And you.
No, we're not.
Okay. Now, folks, what does this mean about the individual worker?
No
They're
value.
No value. It means the individual worker has really no value. So it's going to be a lot tougher. The other thing that's different for the average working man and working woman in Europe is that, when you were a craftsman or a farmer, who were the people that you worked with all the time? Your family. Now, who do you work with? Strangers. Strangers, you move into factories, you move off the land, you're inside. Are there any safety regulations in the factory at this time?
No. The jungle.
Yeah.
Did they live in the factories?
Many times they did not. There were some factories, like the Lowell Project in New England, where they would have dormitories on site. But for the most part, no, you would just live in urban slums. And your family would be, all living in a one-bedroom apartment. Tenement slums. And for those of you who've read The Jungle, you'll know exactly what a factory was like. There were no safety regulations. And what happened if you became disabled?
You probably couldn't do it.
You probably couldn't do it anymore. You're just going to get fired. You're just going to go. Okay? So that's kind of a deal. Okay? You're not. The other thing about the Industrial Revolution is who is going to be making the money out of the Industrial Revolution?
The owner of the factory.
The owner of the factory. Okay? you're going to have a rising social class of factory owners. And these capitalists are going to be making a lot of money. What about the common workers?
Knowledge.
Not so much. Now, you might say, well, what else does the Industrial Revolution does? Does it change anything else? The Industrial Revolution is also going to make one major change in the world. And that is, it's going to lead towards something called imperialism. Okay? Now, do we know what imperialism is? Okay, there are three types of imperialism. The broad general definition of imperialism is the domination of one country or culture by another country or culture, okay? But there are three basic types of imperialism, okay? Type 1 is military or political. Military or political. I take my flag. I go to Bridget's country. I plant my flag. I have troops in there. And what do? Rule her land as a colony. Okay? Who did that in North America?
We did.
The British and the French.
Yeah.
Okay?
Same.
The British did that in India. The British did that in Canada.
So
They
the
went
British
many
did it
places. In Australia. We kind of did that in the Philippines. We kind of did that in Hawaii. Okay? All right? So the first one is political or military. The second type is economic. So maybe I don't want to spend the money to go and put troops on the ground. But maybe what I want is to extract wealth. Maybe what I want to do is to extract raw materials. Okay? So, what'll happen is then I will sponsor people to lead revolutions. Okay? So, for instance, you could argue that another type of imperialism would say be economic. Maybe we don't rule Saudi Arabia, but we make good deals with Saudi Arabia in the 20s and 30s and 40s because we want their oil. Or maybe we make deals with the government where we put people we support in power in Nicaragua because we want bananas. You know? You understand economic imperialism? The third, and perhaps the most difficult sometimes to identify as imperialism, is cultural. Where one cultural group changes and annihilates the culture of another group, which is really common in the internet age these days.
Is that number 3?
That's number 3. Okay, cultural imperialism. Let me give you a case in point. Okay? In 1999, I traveled to Paris, and it was a wonderful time. I went up and down the Champs-Élysées, saw all of this kind of stuff. It was awesome. But one of the things while we were there is saw that on the Champs-Élysées, which is this grand boulevard in Paris, one of the great shopping districts, guess what they had?
McDonald's. Talk about it.
They had McDonald's, Taco Bell, Hard Rock Cafe, and their movies that they were playing were all American films. True Lies with Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Star Wars Episode 1. Okay? No French movies.
Did they play with subtitles for the French?
We
We.
certainly. And you see this sort of thing. American movies are everywhere. The Avengers are playing, Marvel movies are all over the world.
Okay.
And it's kind of obliterating other people's indigenous cultures. Okay? And you might say, well, Reeves, that's nice. I thought you were talking about the Industrial Revolution. Why are you segueing into imperialism? This makes no sense. Right? What's the connection here? Here's the connection, folks. Here's the connection. The Industrial Revolution is both going to cause imperialism and create reasons to be imperialistic, okay? So let's look at why does it cause imperialism. Okay. Let's say I'm an Australian Aborigine. What, do you all know what Australian Aborigines are? They're the native people to Australia, which you know is the continent down under.
Or the king.
Okay? Now, what kind of technology do they have back then?
Probably not.
Not much.
Boomerangs?
Kangaroos, dingoes that eat babies.
Dingoes that eat babies? That's about it.
Banter thought that was fake when I said that the other day. He's like, that didn't happen. And I was like, look it up. And he didn't believe me.
Okay? So, I mean, there's that. Okay? They don't have very much technology. What's going to be the metal of the Industrial Revolution?
Workers.
Well, workers are important, but you don't actually make them into
Isn't
metal.
the innovations of
Yeah, like the best word processor, you're gonna get steel. So what's gonna be better? Me fighting you having a bamboo stick, or me having a steel blade and gun?
Depends how sharp the stick is.
No,
it doesn't.
Well, in Australia, everything tries to keep them.
It's
So
true.
I guess the environment.
Okay, well, here's the thing, folks. The Industrial Revolution is going to increase technology in Europe. It's going to create guns, cannons, eventually tanks by the early 20th century. What about non-industrialized countries? What about non-industrialized countries like Australia or like the continent of Africa?
They're screwed. Easy to be.
Yeah, there's going to be a wide gap. So if you're the British and you're an island nation that has 10 million people, are you going to be able to go to India, which far outnumbers you, has far more people, and conquer it because you've got guns and tanks and they don't?
Yes.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So this technological gap is going to kind of lead to this difference. Now you might say, okay, that's one cause. Cause number two of why it causes this gap. The Industrial Revolution is going to cause, there's an idea that comes out of the 19th century. And I'm sure you've heard of it before, 1859. It's published. Charles Darwin's Theory of Evolution.
You
And-
were talking about this too.
Yes, and-
Social Darwinism.
And what does Charlie Darwin say? Charles Darwin. What causes an organism to survive? It is most survival of the fittest, most fit to his environment. Okay? Well, a lot of people are going to say, oh, we've got the Industrial Revolution in Britain and France and Germany and the United States, which is going to mean what?
We're the fittest.
We're the fittest. So what does that mean when we go to Africa or Asia or Australia?
Only evolution, man.
It's only evolution, survival of the fittest. And the reason that they don't have guns is because they're not adapted to the modern environment. And just like a lion in the jungle when he's eating a gazelle, what do?
Show no mercy.
Show no mercy. Kill or be killed. So social Darwinism is going to hook into that with the Industrial Revolution. They're going to say, we are superior, and if we're superior, what can we do? Whatever we want to do.
Impose our will.
Impose our will. Third, those who aren't necessarily social Darwinists are going to be, if you will, kind of cultural imperialists. And they're going to say, well, what religiously does France, Britain, the United States all have in common? We're all Christian. What is Asia, Africa, and Australia with their indigenous people not?
Christian.
So what are we doing?
We're not going to make them be Christian.
We're going to make them be Christian. So I know some of you may have read Things Fall Apart or something, Chinua Achebe. The story of that is basically this third thing. Missionaries coming from the United States, France, Britain, going, and then what are they telling people who are there? That their religion is wrong. That everything, that their whole culture is wrong. You can see this in the United States with the Plains and the tribe, the Sioux tribes. That was Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee.
That was when he cried.
Yeah.
That was really sad.
And I mean, that's huge. So the Industrial Revolution is going to kind of cause, these are the reasons it causes. Now, what are some other reasons, what are some reasons that the Industrial Revolution made imperialism necessary? Some ways that the Industrial Revolution made imperialism necessary. Well, what do you got to do to manufacture stuff?
Have people.
Well, you got to have people, but once you have, and they had people in those countries, but you need raw materials. So you got to go overseas and you got to get raw materials.
So you sometimes have to force it.
So you have to go take, if you got to go over and take the material from people. So if the United States wanted bananas, where did they have to go? They had to go overseas. If you want oil, where do you have to go besides Texas and Oklahoma?
Overseas.
Overseas. Does that make sense? Okay, so you got to get those raw materials. The second reason, folks, and if this makes sense to you, and maybe it does, and maybe it doesn't, but after you make so many shoes or so many shirts or whatever for the people of Britain or France, the United States, then what do you got to do?
Sell them.
Sell more. Okay, so besides raw materials, the other reason it was kind of necessary or influenced imperialism is that you got to sell more. You got to have markets. So you need raw materials and markets.
So obviously they didn't like sell like the guns and cannons and tanks and stuff to other countries, but did they sell like the shoes and stuff like that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Did they trade and stuff?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at it with triangular trade, the very proto-forms of this is what kind of starts the slavery trade. You know, I mean, ultimately over time, and sometimes if we had friends who would, friends, there you go, Garth Brooks, there you go, you would have sometimes like with cultural or economic imperialism where you didn't want to have your own troops there, you might give guns to people that you wanted to rule for you in your name there. Okay.
Are we talking about like Europe right now or America? Because I know we talk about this a lot in American history. Are we like in both?
It's basically yes. Imperialism was kind of a bigger deal in Europe than it was in America because literally in the mid-19th century there was a saying, and you may have heard this, but the sun never sets on the British Empire because literally in every time zone across the globe, the Brits controlled something. They controlled over a quarter of the land's surface, the Earth's surface. That's right. And why were they able to do that? Because of the Industrial Revolution.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Semi off topic. What
Okay.
is the Brexit deal thing? I'm so
Oh.
confused.
The what? The what?
The stuff in the
Brexit is that's a great question. Brexit is a mess. Short version. In the 1990s, okay? I'm glad you asked this. There had been a move after World War II to start basically an economic union where there could be free trade throughout Europe. Because, you know, Europe is geographically fairly small, or at least Western Europe. You know, like France is about the size of Texas, for example. Britain is smaller than New England, okay? America, the United States of America has a lot more land mass. And, basically when you used to travel from country to country to country, you'd have to exchange currency like, a pound for a franc, and, for a lira if you went to Italy. And so you lose money every time you do that. Secondly, you may want workers to move from country to country sometimes. And do you really want to go through customs every time you go 50 miles on the train? So basically they wanted to build a common market and go to a common currency. And by the early 2000s, that's what they've done. They've gone to something called a euro. So instead of francs in France or pounds in Britain, you'd go to this euro, although Britain never actually got on board with that. Or Deutschmarks in Germany, whatever. The other idea behind that is that it's kind of this overarching idea that nationalism is kind of a bad thing. Beijing World War I, Beijing World War II, all about nationalism. Maybe we want to step away from that. If we all trade together openly, maybe we're not going to want to cut each other's throats and water our fields with our enemy's blood, like it said in the original version of the French national anthem. You know, maybe that would be a good thing. So, long story short, they started this economic union. Now, there were some fairly conservative folks in Britain about 2 or 3 years ago, led by a dude by the name of Nigel Farage, who argued that being part of the economic union, Britain was losing some of its national sovereignty. You know, we aren't able to set economic policy, and if we get away from the pound and adopt the euro, then we're losing control of the currency, and we have to listen to what people in Germany say or Spain, and we don't really want to do this. So David Cameron at the time said, okay, well, I'm going to throw who's the prime minister, said we're going to have a vote and see what the referendum and see what the people think. And by a very narrow margin, the people of Great Britain voted to leave the economic union, the EU, okay? And so Brexit is basically Britain exiting the EU. That's what Brexit is. The problem is, a lot of people voted for it, I think, have buyer's remorse. They thought this would never actually happen. It's kind of a lark, like, yeah, we're going to leave the EU. Well, what's the problem with leaving the EU? Yeah, you can't get back in. That's problem number one. Problem number two, who do they trade with? Everybody in Europe, which now means what? They're going to have to pay for it. It also means that international businesses that are headquartered in London, which is a major international city, now will be moving elsewhere potentially because they don't want to have to deal with 2 sets of governmental regulations. And then there's one more problem, and this is really the sticking problem right now. Britain today, this is a really good question, Kat.
I always see it in the news and I have no idea what it means.
This, of course, is Britain. This is Great Britain. This is Ireland, but you'll notice that there's a red line here. That's because one part of Great Britain is Northern Ireland. Ireland received its independence in the 20s, but Great Britain kept Northern Ireland because there were a lot of Protestants of Ireland who still lived up here, and they were loyal to Britain. Well, the problem is, if you just had this area, you don't have to worry about border crossings, because what's the border? Water. But if you have a hard border right here, what's the problem? You're cutting off Irish families. And there was like years and years and years of like bloody civil war called the Troubles between Protestants and Catholic Irish folks. And so the question is, how do you deal with this border crossing? Nobody's got a good idea.
Still struggling with that.
And nobody has a good idea on this. And so yesterday, Parliament in Great Britain voted to postpone Brexit until the end of June. They were supposed to be done by basically the end of this month. There is still no plan on how to achieve Brexit. Prime Minister Theresa May has put plan after plan after plan out there, and it's been voted down by her own party. And I don't know what's going to happen. There is a part of me that hopes that they put a referendum back on and re-vote and see what happens. Yes,
A lot?
it will affect the United States
Okay.
because we're going to have separate trading deals with EU and Britain.
So like
I mean, it's going to be a major drag on the economies, major world economies. I mean, this potentially could lead to a recession.
where's the tea?
So Britain's gonna have their own government and then the rest of Europe's gonna have theirs.
So excited.
And then we're just in Europe.
Okay, guys, do you remember something called the Treaty of Versailles?
Yes.
Okay, remember the Treaty of Versailles basically said that Germany had to pay a big chunk of war reparation or debt payments. That made a drag on Germany's economy. which then made a drag on its trading partners throughout Europe, which eventually kind of spiraled into other problems. Now, I'm not saying that Brexit, it's the most essential meal of the day, but Brexit is necessarily going to be is going to lead to a Great Depression, but it probably will lead to a pretty substantial economic recession because, you know, it's going to cause problems with Britain trading with other people. We're a major trading partner with them. It's going to slow down the entire economy. I mean, if it were up to me, I would just hope that they would vote again and then say, well, we were wrong. We're going to stay in the EU. But you know, the conservative element, the Nigel Farage group is more kind of a nationalistic thing, and they're like, well, we're giving up too much of our economic rights, and so we don't want to do that.
And
So that's really what it's all about.
Prime Minister now, is she more,
She's a Tory, she's a member of the Conservative Party, but she's not like an ultra-nationalist.
Yeah.
She's still supporting Brexit because that's what the vote was, but
okay. Because I saw something where they might force her to resign or something like that.
yeah. Well, she's she's been defeated in several parliamentary votes.
Oh, is there like a main item that we like get from Britain and stuff like that that's going to affect us the most, that would be harder to trade for and stuff like that?
Well, I think one of the key things is that London has been one of the major financial centers, banking centers of the Western world, and now they're probably not going to be. Yeah, I mean that's bad. You know. Plus, where are we going to get our tea?
Oh,
That's not my problem.
Panera. Okay, there you go. But that is a great question. I'm glad you asked
I
that.
have no idea what they're talking about.
I
Yeah.
didn't even know that was going on, so.
No, I'm glad you asked that. Okay.
Me too.
Any other questions about Brexit before we move on?
Number 2,
No, we could push it
materials
through
and
the
necessary.
college stuff.
Okay, number 2, raw materials markets.
Yes,
Okay, we got that?
yeah.
Okay.
Number 3, is there a number 3?
No, I think we're good. So, you know, ultimately, the industrial revolution is going to cause some deep divides. It's also going to cause a movement called Romanticism. Okay? Because now, if you're working in a factory, you're working inside. You're separated from nature. Where if you were on a farm, you were outside, you got some sunlight. Factories are in terrible, terrible kind of places. Romanticism of the 19th century is pretty dang important. And what is Romanticism? You can if you want, or I can just kind of talk to you about it. You can kind of get the bullets. It's going to start in Germany, but it's going to spread throughout Europe. And it's a reaction, first of all, to the Enlightenment. And do you remember what the Enlightenment stressed? Logic, reason, rationality. During the Romantic period, they would say, no. What it is to feel. What it is to be human is to feel deeply. It's your emotions, it's your passions that make you human. You know? And so what they're going to emphasize is art. What they're going to emphasize is individual feeling. Okay? The Enlightenment emphasized universal principles like all people are created equal. You need freedom of speech. And the Romantics would say, can you eat free speech?
For breakfast.
No.
Can you feel free speech? You can't do any of that stuff. So basically, what they're going to say is that it's about feeling. It's about emotion. And they're going to emphasize things like nature. So they're going to draw a lot of truth from nature. And they're going to be spiritual, whereas the Enlightenment tended to be secular. But their spirituality is going to be less conventional religion, and if you will, a little bit more New Agey. God is in nature. God is in, the trees and the forests. You don't have to, you can go for a walk in nature and realize God's glory. You don't have to be sitting in a pew, if you will. And they're going to say that experiential learning, experiential life is more important than pure logic. Okay? They're also going to be very influenced on ideas like compassion, which we saw with Jean Valjean and Victor Hugo. They're going to be very influential, and like with Jean Valjean, you remember the scene where you see Jean Valjean being a very strong dude lifting the carriage up and all of that? That again is kind of a paean to the thing about nature. It's beings, the human experience, the physicality of things. Now, there is a little downside to the Romantic period too. Romanticism is going to also look at nationalism. Because they're going, yeah, it sounds good up to this point. Because then it's going to hit nationalism. You might say, how does it identify with nationalism? Well, they're going to believe that every ethnic group has its individual folk culture.
Oh, there you go.
So there's an Italian spirit,
There it is.
and there's a German spirit, and there's an English spirit, and there's a French spirit. And what's the problem with that?
Do we all think that there's no
They're going, yes, and everyone's better.
I think we almost got there.
We almost got there. They're also then going to be looking to a heroic past. Okay, so one of Victor Hugo's other famous novels is The Hunchback of Notre Dame,
It's a good movie.
which is going back to medieval times, looking for heroes. You'll see 19th century German operatic guys like Wagner, Richard Wagner, looking back at the Valkyries and Teutonic German medieval traditions and holding them up. And so, you get this idea of a heroic past. You also have this idea of a folk culture. That's where you have the Brothers Grimm, very romantic. We're going to look at what the common people think, and there's wisdom in the German common person, or the English common person. What's kind of the American prototype of Romanticism? There's a literary group that comes out of this. Transcendentalists, very good.
I've never heard of that.
Transcendentalists, very good. And who are a couple of the key
Thoreau and
transcendentalists?
Emerson.
Thoreau and Emerson, you got it.
Yeah, I'm in lit right now. So
No, very good.
You better tell Upchurch what you just did.
He's gonna be.
We'll
he's
tell
gonna
him.
go. It's
I
nice.
just won my
Nice.
4th Kahoot, so I'm about to get into those points.
Oh, yeah. I never won the
Okay.
That's so ferocious in this game.
All right, let's talk a little bit about some of the examples of Romanticism in literature in the 19th century. Victor Hugo, Les Mis, which you've just experienced, the Les Mis treatment.
Oh, so good.
That is a prime example of Romanticism.
How is it a musical? I can't.
Because Andrew Lloyd Webber, King of the Descending Scale, decided to make it into one.
And I heard
Few
you
years
don't
ago.
like it.
No, it's not that I don't like it, I hate it.
All right. Straight up.
Why do you hate it so much? You don't like Hugh Jackman?
I love you, just
I like Hugh Jackman, I just prefer him with claws.
What about In the Greatest Showman?
He needed claws.
You need a close. It's a good movie.
So you don't like Andrew Lloyd Webber?
I mean, you are bad.
I really don't.
I've never seen
Everything that Andrew Lloyd Webber does is descending scales. The Phantom of the Opera.
I don't
You
like
don't
You know.
like the Phantom of the Opera?
No.
Oh my god.
He hates it. He doesn't dislike it. He hates it.
No.
No.
I know, but that's okay. You can't. Millions of people
I'm going
do.
to.
Do you
I'm
like
going
any
to look at-
musicals?
Yeah.
Which ones?
Oh, The Wizard of Oz.
Woo! Okay.
I see how you
Do you like Annie?
My favorite musical of all time has got to be The Music Man by Meredith
That's,
Willson.
did you know it's coming
I love
back
that.
to Broadway with Hugh Jackman as the Music Man?
I did not know
Without
that.
claws. Oh. You're not gonna like it. You're not gonna like
Sometimes
it.
better to ask.
But I Music Man's great. I love that. There are other musicals that I like, but the one that came out with Les Mis a few years ago, it's all singing. There's no dialogue, and that's just horrible. Plus the guy who played Maximus in Gladiator could not sing, and he was Javert.
Yeah.
This is horrible.
I can't think of his name right. Russell Crowe.
Not
He
singing
just
a
could
row.
not sing, and it was just like,
They hired him for the name.
I am Javert. I must arrest you. I cannot sing, but I am famous and an action star. Therefore, I believe in enforcing the law. And there was like 3 hours of this, and it was just like, no.
It does make you uncomfortable. It did that with Moe.
Yeah, it just didn't work. Okay, Alexander Dumas. Okay, it's pronounced Dumas. Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
That's it, is it?
Okay, now, folks, Alexander Dumas. He wrote a lot of things, but famously he wrote the Three Musketeers, which you may be aware of, the Count of Monte Cristo. We're both looking kind of at a famous fact. The interesting thing about Alexander Dumas is he had multiracial heritage and was widely accepted in France. His father was a Haitian and came over and actually served as an officer in Napoleon's revolution.
What's your opinion on Napoleon Dynamite then?
Love it,
Love, okay, good.
love it.
Good.
Okay,
Just check himself for a couple hours.
Hans Christian Andersen. He is kind of the Danish version of the Brothers Grimm. Collected many famous folk tales, including The Little Mermaid, which is a lot different in its original folk version than what you see in the Disney version. It doesn't end so well for her.
She steps on glass every time she takes a step. It's like feeling like she stepped on.
Yeah, it's no good. And that you're familiar with the Brothers Grimm, and then Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who is probably the most famous British romantic poet. Now we're going to take a look at one of the famous painters, Eugene Delacroix, romantic painter. Excuse me. We're going to take a look at Delacroix's famous painting here of Lady Leading the People.
We're in the Louvre in Paris looking at a large canvas by Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People. This painting dates to 1830. This is Romanticism.
It depicts an event of 1830. This is a contemporary subject. It's important to remember that large paintings like this were generally reserved for history paintings, at least according to the rules of the Academy. But here, like Géricault before him, Delacroix is taking on a contemporary subject. This is something that people in Paris experienced in July of 1830.
This was the revolution that ousted the reactionary king, Charles X, and installed on the throne the more moderate king, Louis Philippe.
But we're seeing a moment where the outcome of the revolution is not sure. We're seeing fighting on the...
Delacroix's Lady Leading the People is probably the most famous Renaissance, or I'm sorry, romantic painting out there. And they went through that pretty well line by line of what that is, but it does encapsulate what this feeling is all about. On Monday, we'll finish up the Romantic period, and then we'll be looking at some important social thinkers that come out of this, including Karl Marx, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Charles Darwin.
Okay, this is like such a good question, but why is it so important? Because they were like, not good for that. Like, how does that realize that just starting up?
It's like motherhood.
Motherhood.
See, back then it wasn't sexual.
Right. That's spot on.
Thank you.
Spot on.
Abby,
I